Yes, good evening. It's 7 p.m. I did watch the early Danish evening news. Yes, I have to read it again. I have to read about the Pacific War one more time in the future because it's just too hot. It's still 30 and that will drop a bit in the next many hours. Then it will be hot again tomorrow. I need a minute. To do myself ready. And the memory card is full. No, I have to read it again in the future. But when, I don't know.
Fleet, intercepting many troop transports, and cutting off nearly all the oil imports essential to weapons production and military operations. By early 1945, Japanese oil supplies were so limited that its fleet was virtually stranded. The Japanese military claimed its defenses sank 468 Allied submarines during the war. 137. In reality, only 42 American submarines were sunk in the Pacific due to hostile action, with 10 others lost in accidents or as result of friendly fire. 138. The Dutch lost 5 submarines due to Japanese attack or minefields. 139. And the British lost 3. The torpedoed Marquez, as seen through the periscope of an American submarine, Nautilus. In June 1942, American submarines accounted for 56% of the Japanese merchantmen sunk. Mines or aircraft destroyed most of the rest. 138. American submariners also claimed 28% of Japanese warships destroyed. 140. Furthermore, they played important reconnaissance roles and rescued hundreds of downed flyers. Within hours of Pearl Harbor, in retribution against Japan, Roosevelt promulgated a new doctrine, unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. This meant sinking any warship, commercial vessel, or passenger ship in Axis-controlled waters, without warning and without aiding survivors. While Japan had a larger number of submarines, they did not make a significant impact on the war. In 1942, the Japanese fleet submarines performed well, knocking out or damaging many Allied warships. However, IJN, and pre-war U.S. doctrine stipulated that only fleet battles, not commerce raiding, could win naval campaigns. So, while the U.S. had an unusually long supply line, leaving it vulnerable to submarine attack, Japan used its submarines primarily for long-range reconnaissance and only occasionally attacked U.S. supply lines. The Japanese submarine offensive against Australia in 1942 and 1943 also achieved little. 141. As the war turned against Japan, IJN submarines increasingly served to resupply strongholds which have been cut off, such as Truk and Rabaul. In addition, Japan honored its neutrality treaty with the Soviet Union and ignored American freighters shipping military supplies from San Francisco to Vladivostok. 142, much to the consternation of its German ally. The I-400 class, the largest non-nuclear submarines ever constructed. The U.S. Navy, by contrast, relied on commerce raiding from the outset. However, the problem of Allied forces surrounded in the Philippines in early 1942 led to diversion of boats to guerrilla submarine missions. basing in Australia placed boats under Japanese aerial threat while en route to patrol areas, reducing their effectiveness, and Nimitz relied on submarines for close surveillance of enemy bases. Furthermore, the standard issue Mark 14 torpedo and its Mark 6 exploder both proved defective and were not corrected until September 1943. Worst of all, the fourth year, a U.S. Customs officer had seized a copy of the Japanese Merchant Marine Code, not knowing that the Office of Naval Intelligence had broken it. 143. The Japanese promptly changed it, and the new code was not broken again by Op 20G until 1943. Only in 1944 did the U.S. Navy begin to use its 150 submarines to maximum effect, installing effective shipboard radar, replacing commanders deemed lacking in aggression, and fixing the faults in their torpedoes. Japanese commerce protection was shiftless beyond description, and convoys were poorly organized and defended compared to Allied ones, a product of flawed IJN doctrine and training. The number of American submarines patrols and sinkings rose steeply. 350 patrols, 180 ships sunk in 1942. (350, 335) in 1943, and 520, 603 in 1944. 145. By 1945, sinkings of Japanese vessels had decreased because so few targets dared to venture out on the high seas. In all, Allied submarines destroyed 1,200 merchant ships, about 5 million tons of shipping. At critical stages of the Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Lit campaigns, thousands of Japanese troops were killed or diverted from where they were needed. Over 200 warships were sunk, including a battleship, and no fewer than 8 carriers. Underwater warfare was especially dangerous. Of the 16,000 Americans who went out on patrol, 3,500, 22%, never returned, the highest casualty rate of any American force in World War II. 146. The Japanese losses, 130 submarines in all, 147, were higher. 148. Japanese offensives in Asia, 1944. Japanese counteroffensives in China, 1944. In mid-1944 Japan mobilized over 500,000 men, 149, and launched a massive operation across China under the code name Operation Ichigo, the largest offensive of World War II, with the goal of connecting Japanese-controlled territory in China and French Indochina and capturing air bases in southeastern China. American bombers were based. 150. Though Japan suffered about 100,000 casualties, 151. The Seatux, the biggest in several years, gained much ground for Japan before Chinese forces stopped the incursions in Guangxi. Despite major tactical victories, the operation overall failed to provide Japan with any significant strategic gains. A great majority of the Chinese forces were able to retreat out of the area and later come back to attack Japanese positions at the Battle of West Hunan. The constant defeats the Japanese suffered in the Pacific meant that Japan never got the time and resources needed to achieve final victory over China. Operation Ichigo created a great sense of social confusion in the areas of China that it affected. Chinese communist guerrillas were able to exploit this confusion to gain influence and control of greater areas of the countryside in the aftermath. 152. Japanese offensive in India, 1944. Chinese forces on M3A3 Stuart tanks on the Ledo Road after the Allied setbacks in 1943. The Southeast Asia Command prepared to launch offensives into Burma on several fronts. In early 1944, the Chinese and American troops of the Northern Combat Area Command, NCOC, commanded by the American Joseph Stilwell, began extending the Ledder Road from India into northern Burma, while the Indian 15 Corps began an advance along the coast in Arakan Province. In February 1944, the Japanese mounted a local counter-attack in Arakan. After early Japanese success, this counter-attack was defeated in the Battle of the Admin Box whence isolated Indian divisions of 15 Corps stood firm, relying on supplies dropped by parachute. The Japanese launched a long-planned offensive, codenamed Operation Yugo, into India in mid-March. 153, Lieutenant General Slim, commanding 14th Army, and his forward commander Lieutenant General Jeffrey Scoones, planned to withdraw into the Imphal Plain and force the Japanese to fight with their communications stretching over scores of miles of jungle trails. However, they were slow to respond when the attack was launched and did not foresee some Japanese objectives. 154. Some British and Indian units had to fight their way out of encirclement, but by early April, British Indian troops during the Battle of Imphal had concentrated around Imphal. Several units were flown from the Arakan to reinforce them. A Japanese division which had advanced to Kohima in Nagaland cut the main road to Imphal and isolated a small British garrison, but failed to capture the whole of defences at Kohima. During April, the Japanese attacks against Imphal failed, while fresh Allied formations relieved the garrison of Kohima and drove the Japanese from the positions they had captured on Kohima Ridge. As many Japanese had feared, their inadequate lines of communication and the failure of Mutagachi's gamble on an early victory meant that their troops starved. Once the monsoon rains descended in mid-May, they also succumbed to disease in larger numbers. During May, while Mutagachi continued to order attacks, the Allies advanced southwards from Kohima and northwards from Imphal. The two Allied attacks met on the 22nd of June, breaking the Japanese siege of Imphal. The Japanese finally broke off the operation on the 3rd of July. They had lost over 50,000 troops, mainly to starvation and disease, the worst defeat suffered by the IJA to that date. 155. Although the advance in Arakan had been halted to release troops and aircraft for the Battle of Imphal, the Americans and Chinese had continued to advance in northern Burma, aided by the reinforced Chindits operating against the Japanese lines of communication. In mid-1944, the Chinese Expeditionary Force invaded northern Burma. They captured a fortified position at Mount Song. 156. By the time campaigning ceased during the monsoon, the Northern Combat Area Command had secured a vital airfield at Myitkyine after a prolonged siege, which eased the problems of air resupply from India to China over the hump. Beginning of the end in the Pacific, 1944. In May 1943, the Japanese prepared Operation Z, or the Z Plan, which envisioned the use of Japanese naval power to counter American forces threatening the outer defense perimeter line, from the Aleutians down Thruff Wake, the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, Nauru, the Bismarck Archipelago, New Guinea, then westward past Java and Sumatra to Burma. 157. In 1943-44, Allied forces in the Solomons began driving relentlessly to Rabaul, eventually encircling and neutralizing the stronghold. With their position in the Solomons disintegrating, the Japanese modified the Z Plan by eliminating the Gilbert and Marshall Islands and the Bismarck Archipelago as vital areas to be defended. They then based their possible actions on the defense of an inner perimeter, which included the Marianas, Palau, Western New Guinea, and the Dutch East Indies. Meanwhile, in the Central Pacific, the Americans initiated a major offensive. beginning in November 1943 with landings in the Gilbert Islands. 158 Japanese garrisons in the Gilberts and then the Marshalls were crushed. 158 The strategy of holding overextended island garrisons was fully exposed. 159 In February 1944, the U.S. Navy's Fast Carrier Task Force, during Operation Hailstone, attacked the major